Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining this lightning talk. After that little glitch, we will move on towards this session at Platform Summit. I'm really glad to be back once again. And the topic for this lightning talk is going to be Arazzo. Now, it's something that you might have heard about, come out very recently, but it is essentially the latest specification that has come out of the OpenAPI Initiative. And it's all about describing API workflows. And I'll talk about why that is important, why that's relevant. We'll talk a little bit about some of the dominant use cases that sort of drove us to create this specification, and then the specification itself in the different components associated with it, and a little bit of a hint to the roadmap that you can imagine going forward. So, quick introduction of myself. I am Buddha. I'm a developer advocate at Tyke, but also the board chair of the OpenAPI Initiative. You might know the OpenAPI Initiative as the people behind the OpenAPI specification itself. So this is yet another new specification that's come in to hopefully make life a lot easier for those who are consuming APIs, and not just a single APIs, but using or consuming APIs to achieve specific business outcomes. So that's what Arazzo is. It's actually an Italian word for tapestry. And the reason we chose this, there is a bit of a history behind how long it actually took us to get there. But the reason we chose this name was it was a way for us to weave together APIs to achieve specific outcomes. It's all about API or chaining APIs. And the reason why this is relevant or important is because when you think about API or API creation, there are a few specifications out there, OpenAPI specification being one of them, async APIs being another one, GraphQL being another one. And what they really do well is essentially they describe the surface area of an API. Everything that, all the endpoints around it, how you would design your API potentially, how you would document those APIs once you get that into a specific tool. It does a really good job of doing that. However, when you think about how you consume APIs on a regular basis, they are typically driven by trying to achieve very specific outcomes or specific objectives. And in which case, it's not just about a single API, but actually chaining together multiple APIs to achieve that specific objective. And that's why you need a specification like Arazzo to achieve those outcomes that are driven by specific use cases or tasks, and they can span multiple APIs or multiple specification or descriptions pooled together to get that outcome. So with that little bit of an introduction, hopefully you get a bit of an understanding of why we were trying to create something like this. Arazzo came out, I think, earlier this year. I think it was roughly about March, April when it first came out. It is currently in version 1. And what it is, it's essentially a way to describe an approach to document the use cases-oriented workflows in a programmatically readable format. It's actually not just programmatically readable. We've tried to create it as a sort of a balance between machine readable and human readable. And the formats that we are talking about, if you're familiar with the OpenAPI specification, they follow a similar format, which is YAML and JSON, so it's no surprises there. And when I talk about a workflow, it's a series of API calls, which when woven together accomplish a specific business outcome or objective. And this also lends itself to better consumer experience now, because you're no longer thinking about, once again, individual APIs, which you then have to figure out how they all work together, but a specification that then can be added or pooled together with tooling ecosystems or tool chains that would really do a great job of providing the right consumer experience to drive the right outcomes for you. Touching upon a couple of these dominant use cases that brought us to this point once again, and I'll show you some of these in actual action. They are available on our GitHub repository, which you can interact with straight away. But the idea was to provide this deterministic recipe for the use of APIs. So typically, if you think about API specifications or the descriptions that are created based on the specification, they can be a little bit unwieldy, can be a little bit large or long. We wanted to make sure that things are kept modular, but at the same time, you map out how things connect with each other. So that was one of the key areas there. The other part was also improving developer experience through living documentation. Now, in a typical landscape, you think about documentation as obviously you've got the specification coming out of OAS, but you would usually pair that up with how the interactions happen. These are interaction diagrams either living on, say, an HTML site or a portal or some sort of PDFs in some cases, which while takes a lot of effort to actually create, but they become practically obsolete almost at the time you've already created it. So this was a mechanism for you to have a spec paired with certain tooling to make documentation a lot more of a living experience with assertable business value behind it. Because once you're defining those use cases, defining those jobs to be done, you need to have a mechanism to assert whether you're achieving those outcomes. And we'll see how that works through the actual specification as well. We also wanted to go for targeted code generation for APIs. Once again, think about how you have code generation tools today. They are very much based on the API description that's based on the specification itself. And it's kind of verbose in its sense that it's trying to do a lot with that specification itself without really giving too much consideration to your use cases. What this brings to the table is then you can use this spec to generate out tooling or generating out SDKs that are specific to these outcomes once again, which is obviously a more desirable way of approaching it. And this is not limited to open APIs only. Right now, the first version of this is limited to open APIs, but we are working towards incorporating other kind of specifications like async APIs as well. Finally, improved regulatory checks and benchmarking. This is where you think about some of the specific regulation-heavy industries or compliance-heavy industries like financial services, where you've got things like open banking, which does mandate how you approach APIs being cataloged or APIs being interacted with. But with Arazzo's specification, you can actually specify or define exactly how those interactions will take place, and if something goes wrong, what kind of actions that you can take to mitigate any sort of risk or to be able to stop things or prevent things from happening all over. And the similar thing from a security standpoint, you can also extend this into the realm of OpenID Connect and open authorization, where you're again looking at multiple API operations being pooled together to achieve specific outcomes. Elephant in the room, obviously, you cannot have a conference where you do not talk about AI whatsoever and AI agents. So what something like Arazzo does, it provides a more deterministic way in which, again, you are working towards fulfilling specific outcomes. And while this is still untested so far, but the idea behind this is if you're able to provide a more deterministic way in which AI agents consume specifications like this, the output is likely to be first time right, but also every time right. And that's kind of what we want instead of getting surprised each time. Quick overview. I think I just got about 5 minutes-ish left. Quick overview of the Arazzo specification structure. For those who are familiar with the OpenAPI specification, this might not be too much of a surprise because it follows kind of similar patterns, given that it has been created by the same team. Once again, starts off with the info box, which again, it's a bit of a metadata, no surprises there. It talks a little bit about the Arazzo document itself. Then we go into sort of the source descriptions, and this is where you can define the different sources from which the APIs can be chained together. Right now, these can be multiple OpenAPI documents, or they can also be an Arazzo document itself. In the future, we are catering towards more source documentation, source descriptions, including things like async APIs, but that's in the future. Then we go into the workflow segment where, again, you can have specific inputs that you can provide. These are different objects that you can initiate the workflows with. A simple example could be having some sort of an API token, for instance, that sort of gets the ball rolling in terms of your workflow. That's a very crude and simplistic example, but that's the idea there. And then finally, you come into sort of the steps. And this is where you define the different chaining and chaining of API operations, where you're kind of defining your call of API operations from one step to the other. You've got success factors or criteria or the conditions that you would have, and based off of that, whether you take the success actions or the failure actions here. So if things go right, what do you do? If things go wrong, what do you do? And finally get our output out of this step to come in. A simple example of that failure action could be maybe one of the steps gives you back a 401 error, which is where you're kind of getting some sort of token issues over here, and which could trigger a new workflow. And that kind of does the refreshment of the token and then return back to this workflow to finish off where it left off. So that's sort of one of the possible examples there. Going to the final segment, this is where you can think about some of the reusable component. Once again, we don't want things to be overly verbose when it comes to these documents and specifications. So there are reusable components just like what you would have with OpenAPI. And that's kind of what we are trying to achieve with here. So it's a whirlwind introduction to the Arazzo specification. There's obviously a little bit more description, conversations to be had, but this is hopefully an interesting enough introduction to what we've got going right now. Now, if I just move out of this and take you to our GitHub page, which is the Arazzo specification under OAI. I'm going to try and make this a little bit bigger. You would see there are a couple of, if you go to the main page, you will see there's a bit of a description over here, but equally what's interesting is that there are specific examples as well that you can check out. There are a few from a FAPI standpoint, there are a few from the buy now, pay later standpoint, and just to give you a sense of what an Arazzo document actually looks like. This is something, again, looking at that structure, you've got that info object, you've got your source descriptions over here, you've got your workflows and the different properties within, and then finally you go into the steps where you describe exactly how these operations would interact with each other. There's a success criteria, and then what happens when it's successful, and there is also the failure criteria, which what happens when it's not. So with that, I'm going to go back to the presentation to finish off. What's on the roadmap right now? We are working with, or at least hoping to get more tooling providers to get to using up this sort of specification and building out better support for this. We are looking at some of the specific use cases and providing better support for that. Also looking at some of the other open standards like Async API and how we can incorporate that. It almost went into V1, but we kind of restrained ourselves and said, let's get it out there first. We'll work it on the next segment. The idea is to not have breaking changes to the best of our abilities, and that's what we're going for. If you want to be involved as part of these discussions, join us on our OpenAPI Initiative Slack. There is a special interest group, which is now just called Arazzo. There are discussions. There are bi-weekly calls that happen every Wednesday. So get involved. And I look forward to hearing what kind of use cases you have in mind. So with that, thank you so much for having me. Hopefully that was interesting enough.